Alchemy.
Alchemy is an influential philosophical tradition whose practitioners have, from antiquity, claimed it to be the precursor to profound powers. The defining objectives of alchemy are varied, but historically have typically included one or more of the following goals: the creation of the fabled philosopher's stone, the ability to transform base metals into the noble metals, and development of an elixir of life, which would confer youth and longevity. Alchemy differs significantly from modern science in its inclusion of hermetic principles and practices related to mythology, magic, religion, and spirituality. It is recognized as a proto-science that contributed to the development of modern chemistry and medicine. Alchemists developed a structure of basic laboratory techniques, theory, terminology, and experimental method, some of which are still in use today.
Overview.
The ostensible goals of alchemy are often given as the transmutation of common metals into gold, known as chrysopoeia, the creation of a panacea, and the discovery of a universal solvent. However, these only highlight certain aspects of alchemy. Alchemists have historically rewritten and evolved their explanation of alchemy, so that it is difficult to define it simply. H. J. Shepard gives the following as a comprehensive summary. Modern discussions of alchemy are generally split into an examination of its exoteric practical applications and its esoteric aspects. The former is pursued by historians of the physical sciences who have examined the subject in terms of protochemistry, medicine, and charlatanism. The latter interests psychologists, spiritual and New Age communities, hermetic philosophers, and historians of esotericism. The subject has also made an ongoing impact on literature and the arts. Despite the modern split, numerous sources stress an integration of esoteric and exoteric approaches to alchemy. Hermiard, when writing on exoteric aspects, states that they cannot be properly appreciated if the esoteric is not always kept in mind. The prototype for this model can be found in Bolos of Mendes' 3rd century BCE work, Physica Kai Mystica, on physical and mystical matters. Marie-Louise von Franz tells us the double approach of Western alchemy was set from the start, when Greek philosophy was mixed with Egyptian and Mesopotamian technology. The technological, operative approach, which he calls extroverted, and the mystic, contemplative, psychological one, which he calls introverted, are not mutually exclusive, but complementary instead, as meditation requires practice in the real world, and conversely.
Relation to the science of chemistry.
Practical applications of alchemy produced a wide range of contributions to medicine and the physical sciences. The alchemist Robert Boyle is credited as being the father of chemistry. Paracelsian iatrochemistry emphasized the medicinal application of alchemy, continued in plant alchemy, or spagyric. Studies of alchemy also influenced Isaac Newton's theory of gravity. Academic historical research supports that the alchemists were searching for a material substance using physical methods. It is a popular belief that alchemists made contributions to the chemical industries of the day, ore testing and refining, metalworking, production of gunpowder, ink, dyes, paints, cosmetics, leather tanning, ceramics, glass manufacture, preparation of extracts, liquors, and so on. It seems that the preparation of aqua vitae, the water of life, was a fairly popular experiment among European alchemists. Alchemists contributed distillation to Western Europe. The attempts of alchemists to arrange information on substances, so as to clarify and anticipate the products of their chemical reactions, resulted in early conceptions of chemical elements and the first rudimentary periodic tables. They learned how to extract metals from ores, and how to compose many types of inorganic acids and bases. During the 17th century, practical alchemy started to disappear in favor of its younger offshoot chemistry, as it was renamed by Robert Boyle, the father of modern chemistry. In his book, The Skeptical Chymist, Boyle attacked Paracelsus and the natural philosophy of Aristotle, which was taught at universities. However, Boyle's biographers, in their emphasis that he laid the foundations of modern chemistry, neglect how steadily he clung to the scholastic sciences and to alchemy, in theory, practice and doctrine. The decline of alchemy continued in the 18th century with the birth of modern chemistry, which provided a more precise and reliable framework within a new view of the universe based on rational materialism.
Relation to Hermeticism.
In the eyes of a variety of esoteric and hermetic practitioners, the heart of alchemy is spiritual. Transmutation of lead into gold is presented as an analogy for personal transmutation, purification, and perfection. This approach is often termed spiritual, esoteric, or internal alchemy. Early alchemists, such as Zosimos of Panopolis, c. AD 300, highlight the spiritual nature of the alchemical quest, symbolic of a religious regeneration of the human soul. This approach continued in the Middle Ages, as metaphysical aspects, substances, physical states, and material processes were used as metaphors for spiritual entities, spiritual states, and, ultimately, transformation. In this sense, the literal meanings of alchemical formulas were a blind, hiding their true spiritual philosophy. Practitioners and patrons such as Melchior Cybensis and Pope Innocent VIII existed within the ranks of the Church, while Martin Luther applauded alchemy for its consistency with Christian teachings. Both the transmutation of common metals into gold and the universal panacea symbolized evolution from an imperfect, diseased, corruptible, and ephemeral state towards a perfect, healthy, incorruptible, and everlasting state. And the philosopher's stone then represented a mystic key that would make this evolution possible. Applied to the alchemist himself, the twin gold symbolized his evolution from ignorance to enlightenment, and the stone represented a hidden spiritual truth or power that would lead to that goal. In texts that are written according to this view, the cryptic alchemical symbols, diagrams, and textual imagery of late alchemical works typically contain multiple layers of meanings, allegories, and references to other equally cryptic works, and must be laboriously decoded to discover their true meaning. In his 1766 Alchemical Catechism, Theodore Henri de Tschudi denotes that the usage of the metals was a symbol. During the Renaissance, alchemy broke into more distinct schools, placing spiritual alchemists in high contrast with those working with literal metals and chemicals. While most spiritual alchemists also incorporate elements of exotericism, examples of a purely spiritual alchemy can be traced back as far as the 16th century, when Jacob Boehme used alchemical terminology in strictly mystical writings. Another example can be found in the work of Heinrich Unrath, 1560–1605, who viewed the process of transmutation as occurring within the alchemist's soul. The recent work of L. M. Principe and William R. Newman seeks to reject the spiritual interpretation of alchemy, especially as applied to medieval, 16th and 17th century alchemy, stating it arose as a product of the Victorian Occult Revival. There is evidence to support that some classical alchemical sources were adulterated during this time to give greater weight to the spiritual aspects of alchemy. Despite this, other scholars such as Killian and Tilton reject this view as entirely historically inaccurate, drawing examples of historical spiritual alchemy from Boehme, Isaac Newton, and Michael Mayer.
Etymology.
The word alchemy may derive from the Old French alchemy, which is from the medieval Latin alchimia, and which is in turn from the Arabic alchimia, lkymy. This term itself is derived from the ancient Greek chimea, or chemia, with the addition of the Arabic definite article al. The ancient Greek word may have been derived from a version of the Egyptian name for Egypt, which was itself based on the ancient Egyptian word chem, hieroglyphic my, black earth, as opposed to desert sand. The word could also have originally derived from the Greek chemur, meaning mixture, and referring to pharmaceutical chemistry. With the later rise of alchemy in Alexandria, the word may have derived from chemia, and thus became spelled as chimea, and the original meaning forgotten. Its etymology is still open to question.
History.
Alchemy covers several philosophical traditions spanning some 4 millennia and 3 continents. These traditions' general penchant for cryptic and symbolic language makes it hard to trace their mutual influences and genetic relationships. one can distinguish at least three major strands, which appear to be largely independent, at least in their earlier stages: Chinese alchemy, centered in China and its zone of cultural influence; Indian alchemy, centered around the Indian subcontinent; and Western alchemy, which occurred around the Mediterranean and whose center has shifted over the millennia from Greco-Roman Egypt, to the Islamic world, and finally medieval Europe. Chinese alchemy was closely connected to Taoism and Indian alchemy with the Dharmic faiths, whereas Western alchemy developed its own philosophical system that was largely independent of, but influenced by, various Western religions. It is still an open question whether these three strands share a common origin, or to what extent they influenced each other.
Alchemy in Greco-Roman Egypt.
The start of European alchemy may generally be traced to Hellenistic Egypt. The Hellenistic city of Alexandria was a center of Greek alchemical knowledge, and retained its preeminence through most of the Greek and Roman periods. Here, elements of technology, religion, mythology, and Greek philosophy, each with their own much longer histories, combined to form the earliest known records of alchemy in the West. Zosimos of Panopolis wrote the oldest known books on alchemy, while Mary the Jewess is credited as being the first non-fictitious Western alchemist. They wrote in Greek and lived in Egypt under Roman rule. Mythology. Zosimos of Panopolis claimed that alchemy dated back to Pharaonic Egypt, where it was the domain of the priestly class. There is little or no evidence for such a claim, though. Alchemical writers used classical figures from Greek, Roman, and Egyptian mythology to illuminate their works and allegorize alchemical transmutation. These included the pantheon of gods related to the classical planets, Isis, Osiris, Jason, and many others. The central figure in the mythology of alchemy is Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice great Hermes. His name is derived from the god Thoth and his Greek counterpart Hermes. Hermes and his caduceus or serpent staff were among alchemy's principal symbols. According to Clement of Alexandria, he wrote what were called the 42 Books of Hermes, covering all fields of knowledge. The Hermetica of thrice great Hermes is generally understood to form the basis for Western alchemical philosophy and practice, called the Hermetic philosophy by its early practitioners. These writings were collected in the first centuries of the Common Era. Technology. The dawn of Western alchemy is sometimes associated with that of metallurgy, extending back to 3500 BCE. Many writings were lost when the Emperor Diocletian ordered the burning of alchemical books after suppressing a revolt in Alexandria, 292 CE. Few original Egyptian documents on alchemy have survived, most notable among them the Stockholm Papyrus and the Leiden Papyrus X dating from 300 to 500 CE. They contain recipes for dyeing and making artificial gemstones, cleaning and fabricating pearls, and the manufacture of imitation gold and silver. These writings lack the mystical, philosophical elements of alchemy, but do contain the works of Bolus of Mendes, or Pseudo-Democritus, which aligned these recipes with theoretical knowledge of astrology and the classical elements. Between the time of Bolus and Zosimos, the change took place that transformed this metallurgy into a hermetic art. Philosophy. Alexandria acted as a melting pot for philosophies of Pythagoreanism, Platonism, Stoicism and Gnosticism, which formed the origin of alchemy's character. An important example of alchemy's roots in Greek philosophy, originated by Empedocles and developed by Aristotle, was that all things in the universe were formed from only four elements: earth, air, water, and fire. According to Aristotle, each element had a sphere to which it belonged and to which it would return if left undisturbed. The four elements of the Greek were mostly qualitative aspects of matter, not quantitative, as our modern elements are. True alchemy never regarded earth, air, water, and fire as corporeal or chemical substances in the present-day sense of the word. The four elements are simply the primary, and most general, qualities by means of which the amorphous and purely quantitative substance of all bodies first reveals itself in differentiated form. Later alchemists extensively developed the mystical aspects of this concept. Alchemy coexisted alongside emerging Christianity. Lactantius believed Hermes Trismegistus had prophesied its birth. Augustine, 354–430 CE, later affirmed this, but also condemned Trismegistus for idolatry. Examples of pagan, Christian, and Jewish alchemists can be found during this period. Most of the Greco-Roman alchemists preceding Zosimos are known only by pseudonyms, such as Moses, Isis, Cleopatra, Democritus, and Ostanes. Others authors such as Comarios, and Chimes, we only know through fragments of text. After 400 CE, Greek alchemical writers occupied themselves solely in commenting on the works of these predecessors. By the middle of the 7th century, alchemy was almost an entirely mystical discipline. It was at that time that Khalid ibn Yazid sparked its migration from Alexandria to the Islamic world, facilitating the translation and preservation of Greek alchemical texts in the 8th and 9th centuries.
Alchemy in the Islamic world.
After the fall of the Roman Empire, the focus of alchemical development moved to the Islamic world. Much more is known about Islamic alchemy because it was better documented. Indeed, most of the earlier writings that have come down through the years were preserved as Arabic translations. The word alchemy itself was derived from the Arabic word alkymy alchemia. The Islamic world was a melting pot for alchemy. Platonic and Aristotelian thought, which had already been somewhat appropriated into Hermetical science, continued to be assimilated during the late 7th and early 8th centuries. In the late 8th century, Jabir ibn Hayyan, known as Jabir in Europe, introduced a new approach to alchemy, based on scientific methodology and controlled experimentation in the laboratory, in contrast to the ancient Greek and Egyptian alchemists whose works were often allegorical and unintelligible, with very little concern for laboratory work. Jabir is thus considered by many to be the father of chemistry, albeit others reserve that title for Robert Boyle or Antoine Lavoisier. The historian of science, Paul Krauss, wrote, Jabir himself clearly recognized and proclaimed the importance of experimentation. Early Islamic chemists such as Jabir ibn Hayyan, Jabr in Arabic, Jabris in Latin, usually rendered in English as Jabr, Al-Kindi, Archindus, and Muhammad ibn Zakaria Razi, Rhasis or Rhazes in Latin, contributed a number of key chemical discoveries, such as the muriatic, hydrochloric acid, sulfuric and nitric acids, and more. The discovery that aqua regia, a mixture of nitric and hydrochloric acids, could dissolve the noblest metal, gold, was to fuel the imagination of alchemists for the next millennium. Islamic philosophers also made great contributions to alchemical hermeticism. The most influential author in this regard was arguably Jabir. Jabir's ultimate goal was takwin, the artificial creation of life in the alchemical laboratory, up to, and including, human life. He analyzed each Aristotelian element in terms of 4 basic qualities of hotness, coldness, dryness, and moistness. According to Jabir, in each metal 2 of these qualities were interior and 2 were exterior. For example, lead was externally cold and dry, while gold was hot and moist. Thus, Jabir theorized, by rearranging the qualities of one metal, a different metal would result. By this reasoning, the search for the philosopher's stone was introduced to Western alchemy. Jabir developed an elaborate numerology whereby the root letters of a substance's name in Arabic, when treated with various transformations, held correspondences to the element's physical properties. The elemental system used in medieval alchemy also originated with Jabir. His original system consisted of 7 elements, which included the 5 classical elements, ether, air, earth, fire and water, in addition to 2 chemical elements representing the metals, sulfur, the stone which burns, which characterized the principle of combustibility, and mercury, which contained the idealized principle of metallic properties. Shortly thereafter, this evolved into 8 elements, with the Arabic concept of the 3 metallic principles, sulfur giving flammability or combustion, mercury giving volatility and stability, and salt giving solidity. The atomic theory of corpuscularianism, where all physical bodies possess an inner and outer layer of minute particles or corpuscles, also has its origins in the work of Jabir. During the 9th to 14th centuries, Alchemical theories faced criticism from a variety of practical Muslim chemists, including Al-Kindus, Abu al-Rayyan al-Biruni, Avicenna and Ibn Khaldun. In particular, they wrote refutations against the idea of the transmutation of metals.
Alchemy in medieval Europe.
The introduction of alchemy to Latin Europe occurred on February 11, 1144, with the completion of Robert of Chester's translation of the Arabic book of the Composition of Alchemy. Although European craftsmen and technicians pre-existed, Robert notes in his preface that alchemy was unknown in Latin Europe at the time of his writing. The translation of Arabic texts concerning numerous disciplines including alchemy flourished in 12th century Toledo, Spain, through contributors like Gerard of Cremona and Adelard of Bath. Translations of the time included the Turba Philosophorum, and the works of Avicenna and Al-Razi. These brought with them many new words to the European vocabulary for which there was no previous Latin equivalent. Alcohol, carboy, elixir, and Athena are examples. Meanwhile, theologian contemporaries of the translators made strides towards the reconciliation of faith and experimental rationalism, thereby priming Europe for the influx of alchemical thought. Saint Anselm, 1033–1109, put forth the opinion that faith and rationalism were compatible and encouraged rationalism in a Christian context. Peter Abelard, 1079–1142, followed Anselm's work, laying down the foundation for acceptance of Aristotelian thought before the first works of Aristotle had reached the West. And later, Robert Grosseteste, 1170–1253, used Abelard's methods of analysis and added the use of observation, experimentation, and conclusions when conducting scientific investigations. Grosseteste also did much work to reconcile Platonic and Aristotelian thinking. Through much of the 12th and 13th centuries, alchemical knowledge in Europe remained centered around translations, and new Latin contributions were not made. The efforts of the translators were succeeded by that of the encyclopedists. Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon are the most notable of these. Their works explained and summarized the newly imported alchemical knowledge in Aristotelian terms. There is little to suggest that Albertus Magnus, 1193–1280, a Dominican, was himself an alchemist. In his authentic works such as the Book of Minerals, he observed and commented on the operations and theories of alchemical authorities like Hermes and Democritus, and unnamed alchemists of his time. Albertus critically compared these to the writings of Aristotle and Avicenna, where they concern the transmutation of metals. From the time shortly after his death through to the 15th century, 28 or more alchemical tracts were misattributed to him, a common practice giving rise to his reputation as an accomplished alchemist. Likewise, alchemical texts have been attributed to Albert's student Thomas Aquinas, 1225–1274. Roger Bacon, 1214–1294, was an Oxford Franciscan who studied a wide variety of topics including optics, languages and medicine. After studying the pseudo-Aristotelian Secretum Secretorum around 1247, he dramatically shifted his studies towards a vision of a universal science which included alchemy and astrology. Bacon maintained that Albertus Magnus' ignorance of the fundamentals of alchemy prevented a complete picture of wisdom. While alchemy was not more important to him than any of the other sciences, and he did not produce symbolic allegorical works, Bacon's contributions advanced alchemy's connections to soteriology and Christian theology. Bacon's writings demonstrated an integration of morality, salvation, alchemy, and the prolongation of life. His correspondence with Pope Clement IV highlighted this integration, calling attention to the importance of alchemy to the papacy. Like the Greeks before him, Bacon acknowledged the division of alchemy into the practical and theoretical. He noted that the theoretical lay outside the scope of Aristotle, the natural philosophers, and all Latin writers of his time. The practical, however, confirmed the theoretical through experiment, and Bacon advocated its uses in natural science and medicine. Soon after Bacon, the influential work of Pseudo-Geber, sometimes identified as Paul of Taranto, appeared. His Summa Perfectionis remained a staple summary of alchemical practice and theory through the medieval and Renaissance periods. It was notable for its inclusion of practical chemical operations alongside sulfur-mercury theory, and the unusual clarity with which they were described. By the end of the 13th century, alchemy had developed into a fairly structured system of belief. Adepts believed in the macrocosm-microcosm theories of Hermes, that is to say, they believed that processes that affect minerals and other substances could have an effect on the human body. For example, if one could learn the secret of purifying gold, one could use the technique to purify the human soul. They believed in the four elements and the four qualities as described above, and they had a strong tradition of cloaking their written ideas in a labyrinth of coded jargon set with traps to mislead the uninitiated. Finally, the alchemists practiced their art. They actively experimented with chemicals and made observations and theories about how the universe operated. Their entire philosophy revolved around their belief that man's soul was divided within himself after the fall of Adam. By purifying the two parts of man's soul, man could be reunited with God. In the 14th century, alchemy became more accessible to Europeans outside the confines of Latin-speaking churchmen and scholars. Alchemical discourse shifted from scholarly philosophical debate to an exposed social commentary on the alchemists themselves. Dante, Piers the Plowman, and Chaucer all painted unflattering pictures of alchemists as thieves and liars. Pope John XXII's 1317 edict, Spondet quas non exhibent, forbade the false promises of transmutation made by pseudo-alchemists. In 1403, Henry IV of England banned the practice of multiplying metals, although it was possible to buy a license to attempt to make gold alchemically, and a number were granted by Henry VI and Edward IV. These critiques and regulations centered more around pseudo-alchemical charlatanism than the actual study of alchemy, which continued with an increasingly Christian tone. The 14th century saw the Christian imagery of death and resurrection employed in the alchemical texts of Ptus Bonus, John of Ripacissa, and in works written in the name of Raymond Lull and Arnold of Villanova. Nicholas Flamel is a well-known alchemist, but a good example of said epigraphy, the practice of giving your works the name of someone else, usually more famous. Though the historical Flamel existed, the writings and legends assigned to him only appeared in 1612. Flamel was not a religious scholar as were many of his predecessors, and his entire interest in the subject revolved around the pursuit of the philosopher's stone. His work spends a great deal of time describing the processes and reactions, but never actually gives the formula for carrying out the transmutations. Most of his work was aimed at gathering alchemical knowledge that had existed before him, especially as regarded the philosopher's stone. Through the late Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500, alchemists were much like Flamel. They concentrated on looking for the philosopher's stone. Bernard Trevisan and George Ripley made similar contributions in the 14th and 15th centuries. Their cryptic allusions and symbolism led to wide variations in interpretation of the art.
Alchemy in the Renaissance and Modern Age.
During the Renaissance, Hermetic and Platonic foundations were restored to European alchemy. The dawn of medical, pharmaceutical, occult, and entrepreneurial branches of alchemy followed. Francis Melville, in his translation of the Arabic Book of the Composition of Alchemy, commented on the Emerald Tablet and the Hermetic texts by stating, "Here was an ancient body of theological, philosophical, scientific, and medical writings of extraordinary beauty, intellectual power, and spiritual authority, in which Jews, Christians, and Muslims could find confirmations, amplifications, and refinements of their own sacred teachings." In the late 15th century, Marzillo Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum and the works of Plato into Latin. These were previously unavailable to Europeans who for the first time had a full picture of the alchemical theory that Bacon had declared absent. Renaissance humanism and Renaissance Neoplatonism guided alchemists away from physics to refocus on mankind as the alchemical vessel. Esoteric systems developed that blended alchemy into a broader occult hermeticism, fusing it with magic, astrology, and Christian Kabbalah. A key figure in this development was German Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, (1486–1535), who received his Hermetic education in Italy in the schools of the Humanists. In his De Occulta Philosophia he attempted to merge Kabbalah, Hermetism, and alchemy. He was instrumental in spreading this new blend of Hermeticism outside the borders of Italy. Philippus Aureolus Paracelsus, Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, 1493–1541, cast alchemy into a new form, rejecting some of Agrippa's occultism and moving away from chrysopoeia. Paracelsus pioneered the use of chemicals and minerals in medicine, and wrote, "Many have said of alchemy, that it is for the making of gold and silver. For me such is not the aim, but to consider only what virtue and power may lie in medicines." His hermetical views were that sickness and health in the body relied on the harmony of man the microcosm and nature the macrocosm. He took an approach different from those before him, using this analogy not in the manner of soul purification but in the manner that humans must have certain balances of minerals in their bodies, and that certain illnesses of the body had chemical remedies that could cure them. Paracelsian practical alchemy, especially herbal medicine and plant remedies, has since been named spagyrics, a synonym for alchemy from the Greek words meaning to separate and to join together, based on the Latin alchemic maxim, solve coagula. Iatrochemistry also refers to the pharmaceutical applications of alchemy championed by Paracelsus. John Dee, July 13, 1527, December, 1608, followed Agrippa's occult tradition. Though better known for angel summoning, divination, and his role as astrologer, cryptographer, and consultant to Queen Elizabeth I, Dee's alchemical Monas Hieroglyphica, written in 1564, was his most popular and influential work. His writing portrayed alchemy as a sort of terrestrial astronomy in line with the Hermetic axiom as above so below. Entrepreneurial opportunities were not uncommon for the alchemists of Renaissance Europe. Alchemists were contracted by the elite for practical purposes related to mining, medical services, and the production of chemicals, medicines, metals, and gemstones. Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, in the late 16th century, famously received and sponsored various alchemists at his court in Prague, including Dee and his associate Edward Kelly. King James IV of Scotland, Julius, Duke of Brunswick-Lunenburg, Henry V, Duke of Brunswick-Lunenburg, Augustus, Elector of Saxony, Julius Hector von Mespelbrunn, and Maurice, Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel all contracted alchemists. John's son Arthur Dee worked as a court physician to Michael I of Russia and Charles I of England, but also compiled the alchemical book Vesiculus Chemicus. Though most of these appointments were legitimate, the trend of pseudo-alchemical fraud continued through the Renaissance. Petrugia would use sleight of hand, or claims of secret knowledge to make money or secure patronage. Legitimate mystical and medical alchemists such as Michael Mayer and Heinrich Unrath wrote about fraudulent transmutations, distinguishing themselves from the con artists. False alchemists were sometimes prosecuted for fraud. The terms chemia and alchemia were used as synonyms in the early modern period, and the differences between alchemy, chemistry and small-scale assaying and metallurgy were not as neat as in the present day. There were important overlaps between practitioners, and trying to classify them into alchemists, chemists and craftsmen is anachronistic. For example, Tycho Brahe, 1546–1601, an alchemist better known for his astronomical and astrological investigations, had a laboratory built at his Uraniborg Observatory Research Institute. Michael Sandy-Voges, Michael Strzewój, 1566–1636, a Polish alchemist, philosopher, medical doctor and pioneer of chemistry, wrote mystical works but is also credited with distilling oxygen in a lab sometime around 1600. Sandy-Voges taught his technique to Cornelius Drebbel who, in 1621, applied this in a submarine. Isaac Newton devoted considerably more of his writing to the study of alchemy, see Isaac Newton's Occult Studies, than he did to either optics or physics. Other early modern alchemists who were eminent in their other studies include Robert Boyle, and Jan Baptist van Helmont. Their Hermetism complemented rather than precluded their practical achievements in medicine and science.
The decline of European alchemy.
The decline of European alchemy was brought about by the rise of modern science with its emphasis on rigorous quantitative experimentation and its disdain for ancient wisdom. Although the seeds of these events were planted as early as the 17th century, alchemy still flourished for some 200 years, and in fact may have reached its apogee in the 18th century. As late as 1781, James Price claimed to have produced a powder that could transmute mercury into silver or gold. Robert Boyle, 1627–1691, better known for his studies of gases, cf. Boyle's law, pioneered the scientific method in chemical investigations. He assumed nothing in his experiments and compiled every piece of relevant data. In a typical experiment, Boyle would note the place in which the experiment was carried out, the wind characteristics, the position of the sun and moon, and the barometer reading, all just in case they proved to be relevant. This approach eventually led to the founding of modern chemistry in the 18th and 19th centuries, based on revolutionary discoveries of Lavoisier and John Dalton, which finally provided a logical, quantitative and reliable framework for understanding matter transmutations, and revealed the futility of long-standing alchemical goals such as the philosopher's stone. Meanwhile, Paracelsian alchemy led to the development of modern medicine. Experimentalists gradually uncovered the workings of the human body, such as blood circulation, Harvey, 1616, and eventually traced many diseases to infections with germs, Koch and Pasteur, 19th century, or lack of natural nutrients and vitamins, Lind, E. Eichmann, Funk, A. al. Supported by parallel developments in organic chemistry, the new science easily displaced alchemy from its medical roles, interpretive and prescriptive, while deflating its hopes of miraculous elixirs and exposing the ineffectiveness or even toxicity of its remedies. During the 17th century, a short-lived supernatural interpretation of alchemy became popular, including support by Fellows of the Royal Society, Robert Boyle and Elias Ashmole. Proponents of the supernatural interpretation of alchemy believed that the philosopher's stone might be used to summon and communicate with angels. The words alchemy and chemistry were used interchangeably during most of the 17th century. Only during the 18th century was a distinction drawn rigidly between the two. In the 18th century, alchemy was considered to be restricted to the realm of gold-making, leading to the popular belief that most, if not all, alchemists were charlatans, and the tradition itself nothing more than a fraud. The obscure and secretive writings of the alchemists was used as a case by those who wished to forward a fraudulent and non-scientific opinion of alchemy. In order to protect the developing science of modern chemistry from the negative censure of which alchemy was being subjected, academic writers during the scientific Enlightenment attempted, for the sake of survival, to separate and divorce the new chemistry from the old practices of alchemy. This move was mostly successful, and the consequences of this continued into the 19th and 20th centuries, and even to the present day. During the Occult Revival of the early 19th century, alchemy received new attention as an occult science. The esoteric or occultist school, which arose during the 19th century, held, and continues to hold, the view that the substances and operations mentioned in alchemical literature are to be interpreted in a spiritual sense, and it downplays the role of the alchemy as a practical tradition or proto-science. This interpretation further forwarded the view that alchemy is an art primarily concerned with spiritual enlightenment or illumination, as opposed to the physical manipulation of apparatus and chemicals, and claims that the obscure language of the alchemical texts were an allegorical guise for spiritual, moral or mystical processes. In the 19th century revival of alchemy, the two most seminal figures were Mary Ann Atwood and Ethan Allen Hitchcock, who independently published similar works regarding spiritual alchemy. Both forwarded a completely esoteric view of alchemy, as Atwood claimed, no modern art or chemistry, notwithstanding all its surreptitious claims, has anything in common with alchemy. Atwood's work influenced subsequent authors of the Occult Revival including Eliphas Levi, Arthur Edward Waite, and Rudolf Steiner. Hitchcock, in his Remarks upon Alchemists, 1855, attempted to make a case for his spiritual interpretation with his claim that the alchemists wrote about a spiritual discipline under a materialistic guise in order to avoid accusations of blasphemy from the church and state. In 1845, Baron Karl Reichenbach published his studies on odic force, a concept with some similarities to alchemy, but his research did not enter the mainstream of scientific discussion.
Indian alchemy.
According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, the Vedas describe a connection between eternal life and gold. The use of mercury for alchemy is first documented in the 4th to 3rd century BC Arthasastra. Buddhist texts from 2nd to 5th century AD mention the transmutation of base metals to gold. Greek alchemy was introduced to ancient India through the invasions of Alexander the Great in 325 BC, and kingdoms that were culturally influenced by the Greeks like Gandhara. An 11th century Persian chemist and physician named Abu Rayhan Biruni reported that they have a science similar to alchemy which is quite peculiar to them, which in Sanskrit is called rasayana and in Persian rasavatam. It means the art of obtaining manipulating razor, nectar, mercury, and juice. This art was restricted to certain operations, metals, drugs, compounds, and medicines, many of which have mercury as their core element. Its principles restored the health of those who were ill beyond hope and gave back youth to fading old age. One thing is sure though, Indian alchemy like every other Indian science is focused on finding moksha, perfection, immortality, liberation. As such it focuses its efforts on transmutation of the human body, from mortal to immortal. Many are the traditional stories of alchemists still alive since time immemorial due to the effects of their experiments. Since alchemy eventually became ingrained in the vast field of Indian erudition, influences from other metaphysical and philosophical doctrines such as Samkhya, Yoga, Vaisheshika and Ayurveda were inevitable. Nonetheless, most of the Rasayana texts track their origins back to Kaula Tantric schools associated to the teachings of the personality of Matsyendranath. Two famous early Indian alchemical authors were Nagarjuna Siddha and Nityanatha Siddha. Nagarjuna Siddha was a Buddhist monk. His book, Rasindramangalam, is an example of Indian alchemy and medicine. Nityanatha Siddha wrote Rasa Rashnakara, also a highly influential work. In Sanskrit, Rasa translates as mercury, and Nagarjuna Siddha was said to have developed a method of converting mercury into gold. Reliable scholarship on Indian alchemy has been advanced in a major way by the publication of The Alchemical Body by David Gordon White. Trustworthy scholarship on Indian alchemy must now take the findings of this work into account. An important modern bibliography on Indian alchemical studies has also been provided by David Gordon White at Oxford Bibliographies Online.
Chinese alchemy.
Whereas European alchemy eventually centered on the transmutation of base metals into noble ones, Chinese alchemy had a more obvious connection to medicine. The philosopher's stone of European alchemists can be compared to the grand elixir of immortality sought by Chinese alchemists. However, in the Hermetic view, these two goals were not unconnected, and the philosopher's stone was often equated with the universal panacea. Therefore, the two traditions may have had more in common than initially appears. Black powder may have been an important invention of Chinese alchemists. As previously stated above, Chinese alchemy was more related to medicine. It is said that the Chinese invented gunpowder while trying to find a potion for eternal life. Described in 9th century texts and used in fireworks in China by the 10th century, it was used in cannons by 1290. From China, the use of gunpowder spread to Japan, the Mongols, the Arab world, and Europe. Gunpowder was used by the Mongols against the Hungarians in 1241, and in Europe by the 14th century. Chinese alchemy was closely connected to Taoist forms of traditional Chinese medicine, such as acupuncture and moxibustion, and to martial arts such as Tai Chi Chuan and Kung Fu, although some Tai Chi schools believe that their art derives from the philosophical or hygienic branches of Taoism, not alchemical. In fact, in the early Song dynasty, followers of this Taoist idea, chiefly the elite and upper class, would ingest mercuric sulfide, which, though tolerable in low levels, led many to suicide. Thinking that this consequential death would lead to freedom and access to the Taoist heavens, The ensuing deaths encouraged people to eschew this method of alchemy in favor of external sources, the aforementioned Tai Chi Chuan, mastering of the Qi, etc.
Alchemy is a subject of historical research.
The history of alchemy has become a significant and recognized subject of academic study. As the language of the alchemists is analyzed, historians are becoming more aware of the intellectual connections between that discipline and other facets of Western cultural history, such as the evolution of science and philosophy, the sociology and psychology of the intellectual communities, Kabbalism, spiritualism, Rosicrucianism, and other mystic movements. Institutions involved in this research include the Chemistry of Isaac Newton Project at Indiana University, the University of Exeter Center for the Study of Esotericism, ICESO, the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism, ESSWE, and the University of Amsterdam's Sub-Department for the History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents. A large collection of books on alchemy is kept in the Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica in Amsterdam. Journals which publish regularly on the topic of alchemy include Ambix, published by the Society for the History of Alchemy and Chemistry, and Isis, published by the History of Science Society.
Modern alchemy.
Due to the complexity and obscurity of alchemical literature, and the 18th century disappearance of remaining alchemical practitioners into the area of chemistry, the general understanding of alchemy has been strongly influenced by several distinct and radically different interpretations. Those focusing on the exoteric, such as historians of science Lawrence M. Principe and William R. Newman, have interpreted the decknomen, or code words, of alchemy as physical substances. These practitioners have reconstructed physico-chemical experiments that they say are described in medieval and early modern texts. At the opposite end of the spectrum, esoteric alchemists interpret these same decknomen as spiritual, religious, or psychological concepts. Today new interpretations of alchemy are still perpetuated, sometimes merging in concepts from New Age or radical environmentalism movements. Groups like the Rosicrucians and Freemasons have a continued interest in alchemy and its symbolism.
Alchemy in traditional medicine.
Traditional medicine sometimes involves the transmutation of natural substances, using pharmacological or a combination of pharmacological and spiritual techniques. In Ayurveda the Samskaras are claimed to transform heavy metals and toxic herbs in a way that removes their toxicity. These processes are actively used to the present day. Spogarists of the 20th century Albert Richard Riddle and Jean Dubuis merged Paracelsian alchemy with occultism, teaching laboratory pharmaceutical methods. The schools they founded, Les Philosophes de la Nature and the Paracelsus Research Society, popularized modern spagyrics including the manufacture of herbal tinctures and products. The courses, books, organizations, and conferences generated by their students continue to influence popular applications of alchemy as a New Age medicinal practice.
Psychology.
Alchemical symbolism has been used by psychologists such as Carl Jung, who re-examined alchemical symbolism and theory and presented the inner meaning of alchemical work as a spiritual path. Jung was deeply interested in the occult since his youth, participating in seances, which he used as the basis for his doctoral dissertation on the psychology and pathology of so-called occult phenomena. In 1913, Jung had already adopted a spiritualist and redemptive interpretation of alchemy, likely reflecting his interest in the occult literature of the 19th century. Jung began writing his views on alchemy from the 1920s and continued until the end of his life. His interpretation of Chinese alchemical texts in terms of his analytical psychology also served the function of comparing Eastern and Western alchemical imagery and core concepts and hence its possible inner sources, archetypes. Jung saw alchemy as a Western proto-psychology dedicated to the achievement of individuation. In his interpretation, alchemy was the vessel by which Gnosticism survived its various purges into the Renaissance, a concept also followed by others such as Stefan Aoela. In this sense, Jung viewed alchemy as comparable to a yoga of the East, and more adequate to the Western mind than Eastern religions and philosophies. the practice of alchemy seemed to change the mind and spirit of the alchemist. Conversely, spontaneous changes on the mind of Western people undergoing any important stage in individuation seems to produce, on occasion, imagery known to alchemy and relevant to the person's situation. Jung did not completely reject the material experiments of the alchemists, but he massively downplayed it, writing that the transmutation was performed in the mind of the alchemist. He claimed the material substances and procedures were only a projection of the alchemist's internal state, while the real substance to be transformed was the mind itself. Marie-Louise von Franz, a disciple of Jung, continued Jung's studies on alchemy and its psychological meaning. Jung's work exercised a great influence on the mainstream perception of alchemy, his approach becoming a stock element in many popular texts on the subject to this day. Modern scholars are sometimes critical of the Jungian approach to alchemy as overly reflective of 19th-century occultism.
Magnum opus.
The great work of alchemy is often described as a series of 4 stages represented by colors. Nigredo, a blackening or melanosis; albedo, a whitening or leucosis; citrinitas, a yellowing or xanthosis; rubedo, a reddening, purpling, or iosis.
Alchemy in art and entertainment.
Alchemy has had a long-standing relationship with art, seen both in alchemical texts and in mainstream entertainment. Literary alchemy appears throughout the history of English literature from Shakespeare to J.K. Rowling. Here, characters or plot structure follow an alchemical magnum opus. In the 14th century, Chaucer began a trend of alchemical satire that can still be seen in recent fantasy works like those of Terry Pratchett. Visual artists had a similar relationship with alchemy. While some of them used alchemy as a source of satire, others worked with the alchemists themselves or integrated alchemical thought or symbols in their work. Music was also present in the works of alchemists and continues to influence popular performers. In the last 100 years, alchemists have been portrayed in a magical and spagyric role in fantasy fiction, film, television, comics and video games.